So good morning, everybody. This feels like a Climate Friday again, which is awesome. It actually is Friday. So welcome to our first foray into NCA5. We're particularly thrilled and pleased to have Chris Avery and Lisa Lustig with us from the U.S. Global Change Research Program Office. Who've been working very hard to do the transition between NCA4 and NCA5. And so part of the rationale for today's kind of meetup is to hear some of the things that might be coming down the pike so that we can have a chance to do some input into the call that went out a couple weeks back. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Glenn for the opportunity to present to this group. Thank you to Tammy Houston for helping coordinating our ability to be here. The National Climate Assessment, I think, has a long and very proud connection to this group of prestigious scientists. Leslie Ann especially was the chapter lead for our Northeast chapter this last time around for NCA4, and she and I had the opportunity to work very closely together throughout the development of that chapter, which was a wonderful experience for me and hopefully not a horrible experience for her.
Just don't go there.
Next slide. As Glenn said, my name is Chris Avery. I'm the Chief of Staff for the National Climate Assessment, which in practice means that I'm the person actually responsible for executing the process and delivering the product. I oversee the author team and the staff that delivers the climate assessment every 4 years. I know many of you probably have a bit of a background of NCA, and I don't mean to bore those of you who do, but for those of you who know the next 5 minutes what I'm going to talk about, feel free to let your attention wander appropriately. But I want to provide a little bit of a grounding in where USGCRP came from and why the National Climate Assessment exists in the first place. Next slide. So the U.S. Global Change Research Program actually we can go one more slide back. The U.S. Global Change Research Program began as a presidential initiative under President Reagan in 1989, and it was formalized into existence by the U.S. Global Change Research Act, the GCRA, of 1990 under President George Bush. And the charge to the program was to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to both human-induced and natural processes of global change. The intent of building us as the way we have been is we exist as a national coordination office. So we are on an organizational chart underneath the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and we are overseen by a consortium of members from all 13 agencies that have investments and interests in global change. The 13 agencies are listed here. They're publicly available on our website for if you're not familiar with their logos. But the way this functions in practicality is that there is a formalized subcommittee on global change research under OSTP that acts as our functional board of directors. And that provides an opportunity for these agencies to have really in-depth and personal connections to the program and make sure that the program is pulling in a direction that all 13 agencies are comfortable with. Next slide. So within the GCRA, there are a number of different components, but the section that's particularly relevant to this conversation is the section that created the National Climate Assessment. So under GCRA section 106, there is a description of what a national climate assessment needs to be, how often it needs to be delivered, and what it needs to include. We've highlighted sort of the 3 bullets that represent what an NCA has to include here, but the quick summary is that we have to integrate, evaluate, and interpret the findings of the program and discuss the uncertainties around those findings. We have to analyze the effects of global change on 8 very specifically labeled national sectors. And we have to analyze both current trends and project future trends on a particularly articulated timeline. One of the components of the NCA that I'm not listing here, but is actually particularly critical for what we do, is that the NCA's goal is to be policy relevant, but it cannot be policy prescriptive. So what that means in practice is that the report talks about science that's useful for decision makers, helps people understand if you wish to do X, you also need to have Y knowledge, but it cannot tell decision makers what they should be doing. We do not make policy prescriptions. We are making the science of climate change accessible to the people who need to understand it to make choices. Next slide. To date, there have been 4 national climate assessments. As you can see, we haven't necessarily every time hit that 4-year target of when we're supposed to provide them. Some of those are due to scientific limitations, some of those are due to government limitations. But starting with NCA4, for the first time, really was able to achieve this 4-year cycle, which we intend to continue with NCA5. All 4 of these NCAs have certain things in common. They each talk about the science, the climate change science and the impacts to those sectors and regions within the United States. Each has largely met the requirements of the law. Each have had a diverse and robust set of authors, and the diversity and robustness of that author set has increased over time, which we're very proud of. Each has been a fairly substantial document or collection of documents, as in the case of NCA1, and each assessment has had its own unique development process. And that's particularly intentional because we're trying to make sure that this report is useful for the time in which it's published, not set to a standard that was created 30 years ago, creating a report that is actionably useful for today's world. The most recent national climate assessment, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but just to break down, because NCA4 was a unique approach for this time. Next slide. NCA4 came out in 2 volumes. Volume 1 came out in November of 2017, and we called it the Climate Science Special Report. This report was focused specifically on the technical science of climate change and articulated a lot of the key advances that have come since NCA3 published. And you focused a lot on detection and attribution, understanding of extreme events, a lot of information on downscaling information and trying to identify potential surprises that could come up in addition to other things like GCM weighting. You can read that report. It's actually only about 500 pages, so it's long, but it's certainly readable and digestible at the website listed here on your screen. Next slide. Volume 2, which is typically the section of the report that is sort of articulated or talked about as the National Climate Assessment, was released about a year later in November of 2018. And this focuses on the impacts, risks, and adaptation in the United States. So it uses the technical science report as the foundation for then the understanding of impacts and risks and adaptation efforts throughout the United States. It places a really strong emphasis on regional information. The report itself, coming out of nearly 300 authors as a combination of federal and non-federal and reaching nearly 1,600 pages, fully 2/3 of this report is focused entirely on the regional sector, or excuse me, the regions throughout the United States. There are a number of technical sector chapters at the beginning, but they're far shorter. The bulk of the report is focused on regional and localized information. It does use a risk-based framework, so trying to provide a way for people to understand what's at risk and how is it likely to be at risk over time. It does quantify a lot of impacts in terms of economic impacts. There are components of it that include international considerations insofar as how they impact the US interests, because again, this is a US focused report. And it assesses a range of potential impacts and uses case studies to sort of articulate a lot of examples of both what is at risk and examples of really interesting approaches that either states or local groups have taken to try and address impacts. So quick overview of that. You can read the report at nca2018.globalchange.gov, which is again on your slide now. And I would encourage you to definitely, if you haven't had time to spend with that, please do. There are members on this call who participated in writing this report, and it's really an outstanding report that provides not just a useful document, but points to a lot of resources and information that is useful for decision making throughout the US. Next slide. So the more important part of this conversation, what I assume most of the people here are interested in talking about, is we can brag about what we've done in the past, but we published this report and now it's, we can pat ourselves on the back and now it's time to write the next one. So NCA5 is underway at the moment, at least in its initial phases. We have created the governance structure that NCA5 is going to operate under. And one of the first decisions that was made with NCA5 is that because NCA4 was so successful, we're intending NCA5 to follow functionally the same process and the same structure. So there is a federal steering committee made up of representatives from the 13 agencies I referenced at the beginning that are overseeing the development of this process. While we currently do not have an NCA5 director seated, the USGCRP executive director, Mike Cooperberg, who had intended to be here, and I'm filling in his shoes, is acting as our acting director until a director is seated. So we are not delaying, we are moving forward. And some of the initial decisions that have been made, next slide, have allowed us to create our what is the first public component of NCA5's development, which is our call for public comment on the draft prospectus. The draft prospectus is a fairly short description of what we intend to at a high level, include in the report, or what we aspire to include in the report. It is out for public review. It's on the Federal Register right now. And if you go to the website on the slide in front of you, you can access all of that. And we really do welcome and ask, I presented as an ask to this group to please go read that and provide comment. Those comments are the first opportunity here at the very first stage of the process to shape what it is that needs to be covered in NCA5 and what it is that is new that needs to be a priority. That deadline for submission is August 10th, and the material that we get from the public out of that public comment will shape basically everything that comes later. We have a couple of bullets here describing what we would expect to happen over the next 12 months. I can't tell you explicitly on this call when these will happen because they're sort of dependent on a number of steps. But once we get this draft prospectus in, we intend to issue a public call for authors and for technical inputs. We're going to go through the process necessary to actually seat our author teams. Those of you who participated in them last time around will remember that we did a series of workshops throughout the United States, 44 of them all around the country in almost every state. Also a series of webinars, public engagement opportunities to really make sure we're maximizing public comment and public input at the beginning before authors have really written anything. We want these authors to have a clear understanding of the needs and interests and values of the stakeholders that are ultimately the audience for the report. And then once we get through all of that, authors are going to develop a public or a zero order draft, which is largely sort of a fleshed out annotated outline that will again be released to the public, and we'll ask for comments and feedback from everyone, and especially those people who were interested and able to participate in our feedback to date. Next slide. I'm emphasizing this a lot because I really want to make clear to this group that we are putting a lot of effort into trying to engage with as many stakeholders as possible at the outset of this process before the report is written. You know, this report, for better or for worse, has a large impact on the national dialogue around impacts of climate change. And it's really, really valuable to have professional communities like you to be in this and help us make connections and connect to stakeholders and the broader public. You know, there are a lot of products that come out as a result of the National Climate Assessment, both from technical papers and articles and course materials. This is a foundational document in a lot of spaces, and we want to make sure that this document is both scientifically and technically robust and also written and developed in a way that makes it ultimately useful to justify the investment we make in making it in the first place. Next slide. So I like to come to these talks with specific suggestions of what we're asking of you to participate. I already talked a lot about the draft prospectus, but I really do want to emphasize feedback on these public comment opportunities is one of the most effective and direct ways that you can make this report much, much better. And we'd ask that you please share that around with your networks. If you guys have newsletters or just posting on your own LinkedIn pages or however you feel most comfortable, we would really welcome your help in amplifying the opportunity to comment on that draft prospectus. As I mentioned, we're going to have a call for authors and call for technical inputs coming out in the hopeful near future. And when that happens, I would really ask that you stay tuned for that and you nominate yourself. You know, I'm sure Leslie Ann can speak to how much fun she had working on the report. Yeah, and I would welcome you talking to each other and emphasizing how valuable it is to have you personally participate and volunteer in this process. We'll have more opportunities for public reviews along the way. I mentioned those workshops to kind of seed the ground to say if you're interested in hosting workshops or hosting webinars or participating in these public engagement opportunities, we really, really value doing this with partners like you all. and just stay in the loop. And the USGCRP puts out a monthly newsletter. All of our public information on the NCA will always be featured in that newsletter every time we have something valuable to say. We always post all of our information on Twitter to make sure that it's available and out there for people to share and provide feedback. So engaging in those spaces and signing up for those alerts is a really, really effective way to know what's going on at any particular moment. But again, I would emphasize the two most pending and present things for you to do would be comment on the draft prospectus and prepare to nominate either other outstanding individuals or yourselves to participate as authors. Next slide. So before I shut up and we have a more interesting conversation as opposed to me just lecturing, I did want to put this up and say, we are always available to answer questions. We take a lot of pride in being really, really responsive to the community and engaging on what you all want to talk about. Our email addresses are up there. Mike Cooperberg, as I said, is our executive director, and Eliza and I are both here on this call. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all, and I look forward to a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Chris. We really do appreciate that. Leslie Ann, do you want to say anything before we get started? We're going to go ahead and have a little bit of a Q&A, but if you have any comments, I know that you were a lead author, and so if you wanted to speak from your perspective before we get into that, feel free to do so.
Chris, thanks so much for presenting that overview of the transition between NCA4 and what's coming down the pike with NCA5. And Eliza, it's great to have you on the call as well. I think one of the pieces that is critically important is because we are knowledge brokers and because we work so closely directly with the public and a lot of folks who actually use climate services and climate information, that's one of the unique perspectives that we bring as AASC members to a process like National Climate Assessment. And so Jermaine Gell was also a lead author for the Midwest before he retired. And we had a number of other members who are actually on this call right now who provided either author support or helped engage with the engagement workshops that Chris had mentioned. And so I am so tickled pink to be involved as an organization from the get-go to help move this forward. And so to the extent that we can have questions, to the extent that we can share expertise, help bring things to the table that we've been seeing but never had a chance or a forum to maybe share, really welcome your input, everybody who's on the call, but folks who are not on the call, folks who may be on the streaming part of this, however we can capture some of those comments, suggestions, thoughts, priorities for Chris, Eliza, and the entire team, that would be much appreciated.